As we continue our look at the digestive system, we're going to be looking at the esophagus, stomach, and all of the intestines. Of course, the esophagus is a fairly short section of tube that runs through the thoracic cavity behind the trachea and behind the heart. It eventually passes through the diaphragm about right along in here somewhere. But anyway, we have the esophagus. And we will look at the histological composition of the esophagus here in a minute to see more detail in that structure. We'll talk about its function and how the tissues relate to its function. Next, we have the stomach. So all of this right here is the stomach. There's a bit of a sphincter valve here at the top of the stomach called the cardiac sphincter between the esophagus and the stomach. And then down here at the other end, there's what we call a pyloric sphincter between the stomach and the intestine, about right through here. This is the very beginning of our small intestine right here. This is the duodenum. Right here, very beginning of our small intestine. We have three sections of small intestine, the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum, and then we go from there into the colon, or large intestine, in the digestive system. So next we're going to look in detail at the tissues of the esophagus. Now I've drawn two pictures here of the esophagus, one of them in longitudinal section, one of them in cross section. So this is looking down at a cross section where we have the lumen or cavity of the esophagus right here, and in this case the lumen or cavity of the esophagus runs straight up and down the middle. So this is a longitudinal cut, maybe like a frontal view of the frontal section of the esophagus, and this is a cross-sectional cut of the esophagus. Now we want you to know these layers that make up the wall of the esophagus, the esophageal wall. So the innermost part, we've already talked about this when we were talking about tissues, that innermost layer right there, let's work this direction, next to the cavity is made of a stratified squamous epithelium. So that's our inner epithelial layer. That sets on top of a layer of loose connective tissue, and we've mentioned this term already also, the lamina propria. The lamina propria layer. Next to that is a layer of smooth muscle. This particular layer of smooth muscle is called the muscularis mucosa. Muscularis mucosa. Those three things, the epithelium, the connective tissue of the lamina propria, that loose connective tissue, and the muscularis mucosa, those three things together make up what we call the mucosal lining, the mucosa of the esophagus. Beneath that, in purple right here, I have a layer we're going to identify as the submucosa. Submucosa. Submucosa is a layer of dense, irregular connective tissue. Dense, irregular connective tissue. Beyond the submucosa, we have two thick bands of muscle. An inner circular layer of muscle and an outer longitudinal layer of smooth muscle. The very outside of the esophagus right here has a layer of connective tissue we call an adventitia. Adventitia. We generally think of the gut wall as having 4 layers. The mucosa that consists of these 3, the epithelium, the lamina propria, and the muscularis mucosa make up the mucosal zone in there, the innermost part. That's the first. Then beneath that, the submucosa is the next zone. Then the muscularis externa consists of the 2 layers, the inner circular and the outer longitudinal, and then finally on the outside, the 4th layer, the adventitia layer. Okay? If the esophagus were within a body cavity, like your stomach and intestines are, it would have around its outside a layer of mesothelium. But since it's not in the body cavity, there's no mesothelial covering here, and we just refer to this outer layer as adventitia. It's also a loose connective tissue forming that outer covering around the outside. It would lie next to other organs that are in the thoracic cavity. There would be blood vessels out here, there would be the trachea lies next to it, and so on. So there are other structures all around here, and there's just loose connective tissue between the esophagus and those other organs. No layer of mesothelium in there. In this picture, things look a little bit different. We have the same ordering of things. We have this mucosal zone right in here that consists of the muscularis mucosa, lamina propria, and the stratified squamous epithelium. So there's our mucosa there. Then in the purple right there is submucosa. Then in red right here, that area right there would be the muscularis externa. And then on the outside is our adventitia. Now, something about the two is a little bit different. In the cross section, I drew the circular muscle as dashes because the smooth muscle cells would be arranged in that fashion, around in a circle. And the longitudinal muscle, because they're going up and down the esophagus, I made them as small dots, like we're cutting through tiny cells there. Things are reversed when we go into a longitudinal section where the circular muscle that goes around, when we cut through it, we would see the smooth muscle cells in cross-section. And the longitudinal muscle that goes up and down, rather than being dots that we would see because they're running this way, they're now running in this direction, so we represent them with little dashed lines in there. So that they are still inner circular and outer longitudinal. We're just looking at them at a different position at 90 degrees to each other. Now, the next thing we need to talk about is the process of peristalsis. There are just a few mucus glands associated with the esophagus, usually in the upper part of the esophagus, near the beginning of the esophagus. But otherwise, there's no contribution of any kind of secretions that affect digestion. There's no mechanical digestion going on here as we had in the mouth. The only thing that goes on here is that we move the food down the esophagus by a process of peristalsis, which we'll talk about next. Okay, here we're dealing with peristalsis, looking at peristaltic movement in the esophagus. The way this works, after you swallow some food, what we usually refer to at this point as a bolus of food is the common term for that volume of food that is swallowed and enters into the esophagus. So you've got your bolus of food right here. As it moves down the esophagus, there's a reflexive response, a neural response, that causes the muscle in the outer longitudinal layer to bunch up, to constrict in this area right here along where the food is, allows that food to move into that area. Behind that, we have a constricting action from that inner circular layer of smooth muscle. So the longitudinal muscle is contracting in a wave, then moves down the esophagus first, and it is followed by a wave of muscular contraction in the circular muscle that pushes that food ahead of it where the longitudinal muscle is bunched up. So in the next picture here, we've moved it a little bit further. This wave, this movement of the longitudinal muscle is continuing downward, and that constriction of the inner circular muscle has progressed a little bit further. So we're moving that food on through. In the next view, of course, we would keep that wave going where we have the constriction of the longitudinal muscle to the outside, and then followed by the circular muscle to the inside, and it just keeps working like that. I often compare this to like when you're trying to feed a string through a hooded sweatshirt where you lose it in one end or something, and so you have to kind of bunch up and then grab it and pull it, bunch it up, grab it and pull it to keep working it through that tube that the string goes through. And in this case, what we do is we bunch up, and instead of pulling something on through, we squeeze behind it to push it on through that space. So this is a peristaltic wave, this movement of a contraction of the longitudinal muscle preceding a contraction of the circular muscle that allows that food to be moved on into the stomach, this peristaltic action. So, in this illustration, the darker red band, the thicker red band represents my inner circular layer, and this more white area that's kind of just more of a space out here represents my longitudinal muscle. So it's thicker here where the longitudinal muscle is constricting, and it's thinner down here and up above. The inner circular layer that is solid, it's thicker where it's contracting. You're seeing contraction of that muscle, and thinner through the remainder of it. So anyway, that's our drawing of peristalsis. Now moving on to the anatomy of the stomach, the overall structure of the stomach. We want to identify some different regions and parts in this illustration. Starting up here just below the esophagus, that would be the esophagus there. That area near the esophagus, where the esophagus enters into the stomach, is referred to as the cardia or cardiac portion of the stomach. Adjacent to that, there's a portion of the stomach that's kind of pushed up against the diaphragm, kind of a domed up region there beside the esophagus over on this side. This region that's kind of raised up against the diaphragm is referred to as the fundus or fundic region of the stomach. Down on the other end of the stomach, near where we enter into the intestine, there's a region we call the pylorus or pyloric region of the stomach. All of this in between right in here, all the remainder, is referred to as the body of the stomach. At the top of the stomach, near the cardia, we've already mentioned this, there's what we call a cardiac sphincter. So right here in purple, I'm going to do this cardiac sphincter. Cardiac sphincter there near the top of the stomach, and down at the other end of the stomach, there's another sphincter that controls the movement of food from the stomach into the intestine. And this is the pyloric sphincter. So we have sphincters at both ends of the stomach. This primarily prevents movement of food from the stomach into the esophagus, a backward flow of food. That's what we want to avoid having heartburn or GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease. Anyway, so a cardiac sphincter and a pyloric sphincter. Along this outer wall on the left-hand side of the stomach, along here, we often refer to this as the greater curvature. It's a little hard to label here in my picture, but anyway, greater curvature. It's along that greater curvature that we have the attachment of the greater omentum. On this side, notice there's a tighter little curve in here, and this curve in here is referred to as the lesser curvature of the stomach, this tighter curve, and in there you would find your lesser omentum, that membrane that extends between the stomach and the liver. It would be in that area right there, between the stomach here and the liver somewhere up over here. Inside the stomach, the wall, the mucosa of the stomach is thrown into folds, and they're a little hard to illustrate, I guess, but I'll try to just kind of draw some wavy lines in here to represent these folds that run through the wall of the stomach on the inside, and these are referred to as rugae. Rugae. Ruga, with just an A at the end, would be the singular form of that. Single ruga. So that's the overall anatomy of the stomach. Now we're going to talk about the histology, the tissues inside. Okay, this is going to be a little bit of a challenge. I'm going to go through and just name things first, and then I'll go through and label the layers. This would be the lumen of the stomach over here on this side, the cavity of the stomach. This would be the outside lining of the stomach on this side of the stomach. I've got a blue line on there that represents that outer simple squamous epithelium, the mesothelial layer on the very outside of the stomach. Now the four primary zones that we talked about earlier, the mucosa zone is right here down to that first red line. So we've got our epithelium thrown into folds right here, the orange line in there. And beneath that orange line, we have a little bit of green worked in there. That's the loose connective tissue of the lamina propria. So we have epithelium, we have lamina propria, and we have muscularis mucosa. Those three things make up the mucosal lining. In purple right here, submucosa. The submucosal layer, our second layer, submucosa. Our third layer is all this muscularis externa here, and we have three zones in our muscularis externa in this case. The innermost is an oblique layer, so it's not circular or longitudinal, it runs at a funny angle. So the oblique layer, then the circular, and then the longitudinal layers of smooth muscle in the muscularis externa. Then finally, a little bit of loose connective tissue and a little bit of mesothelium, that thin layer of mesothelium on the outside makes up what we call a serosa. Serosa. So let me label this first of all. This is the mucosa from here to here. The next zone right there is submucosa. In the purple. Then we have the muscularis externa with three zones in there, oblique, circular, and longitudinal. And then we have our serosal membrane. And the serosa consists of a thin layer of loose connective tissue, and mesothelium. The serosa. So those are our four layers of our stomach wall. Now, we're going to want to look in more detail in the mucosal zone to see the specific cell types and the overall appearance of this epithelial layer and how it's thrown into what we call gastric glands of the mucosal layer. But anyway, that's the layers of the stomach wall, histological layers of the stomach wall. So here's a look at our gastric mucosa, the epithelial layer, It's thrown into these deep folds here. Lamina propria kind of strung in between these different gastric glands. And then a layer of smooth muscle here, the muscularis mucosa. So to begin with, we know this is the lumen or cavity of the stomach up here at the top. And where we have these entrances into the gastric glands, we refer to these as gastric pits. So there's a single gastric pit. It leads into a single gastric gland. The epithelium that lies against the lumen or the cavity of the stomach up here at the top, these cells up here are referred to as surface mucous cells. Surface mucous cells. We get down into the gland a little bit and we don't see the same kind of appearance to that mucous cell. We see a smaller, more compact mucous cell that stains just a little differently, and we refer to that as a mucous neck cell. Mucous neck cell because it's down in the neck of the gland after we go through that broader gastric pit and get into this part. It tends to narrow, so they call it the mucous neck cell. The gland continues on down through here, and mucous neck cells can kind of be interspersed with other cell types as we move down through the gland. The next cell type we encounter as we move down through here is a parietal cell. They are larger, rounder cells in the epithelial lining, and they have a fairly nice large round nucleus and often 2 nuclei per cell, but anyway, those parietal cells produce hydrochloric acid, HCl. Your gastric acid comes from the parietal cells. They are usually in that mid-reach of the gland, and then down at the very bottom of the gland we get another cell type. The chief cell. The chief cell. Chief cells produce enzymes, digestive enzymes, in an inactive form that we'll talk about here in a minute. So those are the primary cell types of the gastric glands. The surface mucous cells extend into the gland just here at the gastric pit. Then we have mucous neck cells. They're kind of scattered in between these other active cells, the parietal cells in the mid-reaches, and the chief cells down at the bottom of the gland. And as I mentioned, that's the epithelial layer. Then we have lamina propria. The green stuff in there represents collagen fibers in the lamina propria, and we have muscularis mucosa. Along here, a thin layer of smooth muscle that separates all of this material from the submucosal zone of the stomach wall. Next, we're going to talk about the production of these digestive enzymes in the stomach. Short explanation of that. Okay, about the gastric secretions. The chief cells down deep in the gastric gland produce a precursor to the enzyme pepsin called pepsinogen. Pepsinogen. Pepsinogen will be converted to pepsin, the active form of the digestive enzyme, in the presence of hydrochloric acid. HCl, your hydrochloric acid, your stomach acid. Pepsin causes the conversion of proteins to peptides. Peptides are shorter pieces of protein, so it starts the breakdown of protein, the digestion of protein. Peptides are then subsequently broken down further into the amino acids that we're familiar with that make up the proteins. So more digestion has to happen beyond this, but that's the initial stage. pepsin starts working on proteins, breaks them down into peptide units. So the pepsinogen is produced by the chief cell. Hydrochloric acid produced by the parietal cell. So these are your stomach secretions, your primary stomach secretions, in addition to all the mucus produced by surface mucus cells and mucous neck cells of the stomach. So what's going on in that gland? We produce the pepsinogen in that inactive form down deep in the stomach gland. If it were an active form, it might start acting as a digestive enzyme on your own tissues. You don't want to start digesting your cells before that enzyme reaches the stomach where your food is that needs to be digested. So we produce the pepsinogen first, that inactive form. It moves up through the gland, and as it does so, it encounters parietal cells that are producing hydrochloric acid. So as it moves toward the top of the gastric gland, it becomes pepsin. By the time we get toward the top of the gastric gland, we have mucus cells present. Mucus cells produce mucus, a protective lining for the cells of your stomach wall. So that mucus covering to your stomach wall, that thin layer of mucus being secreted by mucous neck cells and surface mucus cells, keeps your pepsin from working on the cells that line your digestive, your stomach wall in that case.